Okay, welcome back to Peak with Roland Smith. We're going to be reading chapters 10 and 11. Here's your question for chapters 10 and 11. It says, Peak has a few different impressions of Mount Everest in these two chapters. Name a couple of them and tell what you think his overall feelings are so far. So there's going to be a couple of things that happen in this chapter. He gets kind of an insight to Mount Everest real quick. Just name a couple of those, tell what you think about him, and tell what you think his overall feelings are, and maybe are they different than what you thought they would be. Okay, so in chapter 9, they had just gone and got a lot of gear with Zopa and Sunjo, and they dropped him back at the hotel. And chapter 10 is called Tibet. It says, the next morning, Sunjo, Zopa, the driver, and two Sherpas were sitting in the tailgate drinking tea. By the look of their disheveled hair and rumpled clothes, they must have slept in the truck. Sunjo confirmed that they had, but only for 2 hours, he said. We were out getting supplies up until then. He wasn't kidding. There was so much stuff piled in the bed, I didn't even know where we were going to sit. We squeezed ourselves between the gear along the two Sherpas, brothers named Yogi and Yash, and we left the blue haze of Kathmandu behind us. We took our time, stopping at Buddhist temples and monasteries along the way, where Zopa picked up boxes of food and supplies. We already had plenty of food, and some of the food he was given wasn't going to last very long up on the mountain. I asked about it, but I got the standard shrug in reply. Away from the city, Nepal was everything I had imagined it to be. Beautiful valleys, rustic villages, fields tilled by oxen-pulled plows, all against the backdrop of the massive, sparkling Himalayas. I had been up on Mount McKinley and Mount Rainier, but they were dwarfed by these snow-covered peaks. We stopped for the night outside a tiny village. Sunjo and I started to help set up camp, but Zopa waved us off. You two, go climb. He pointed to a wall about a quarter mile away. Don't fall. Come down before dark. We didn't have to tell us twice. We jogged over to the wall. It wasn't a difficult climb, but about halfway up, I had to stop and rest to catch my breath. Sunjo, who had picked a more difficult route, scrambled up the rock like a lizard, smiling as he climbed past, which taught me a couple of things about him. He was much better lung capacity than me, and he was competitive. Climbers will tell you that the thing they love about climbing is that it's just them against the rock, blah, blah, blah. That may be true if they're alone on the rock, but put another climber next to them, and the race is on. I was shocked when he blew by me so effortlessly. I was the kid who was going to climb Everest, and Sunjo was just along for the ride up to base camp. Then I reminded myself that 10 days ago, I was climbing a skyscraper a few hundred feet above sea level. Not exactly the best training for scaling the highest peak in the world. If I was going to summit, I was going to have to do better than watch Sunjo's butt disappear over the top as I hung below him, gasping for breath. I think you picked the more difficult way, he said when I finally sat down next to him on the rim. We both knew this wasn't true, but I appreciated him saying it. We sat on the edge for a while, taking in the view. It was too late to climb down before dark, so we decided to rappel to the bottom. Sunjo offered to let me go first, but I shook my head. First up, first down. When we got back to camp, dinner was ready. Zopa didn't say anything about the climb, but there was a spotting scope set up on a tripod, pointed at the wall. He must have watched the whole thing. The next morning, Zopa told us the truck was overloaded, and that Sunjo and I would have to walk with our heavy packs. Why did Zopa do that? Sunjo complained as we watched the truck drive up the road. The truck is fine. We haven't picked up more than 50 kilos of supplies. I shrugged, but I thought that I knew the answer. Zopa thought that a hike with a full pack would do me good and didn't want me to walk alone. Yeah, sorry, Sunjo. The walk was hard, but it was better than bouncing around in the back of a truck, and it gave Sunjo and me a chance to get to know each other better. Sunjo's father didn't want him to become a Sherpa. The reason I climb, he had told him, is so you won't have to. Does your mother know you're on your way to base camp? No, and she would be very upset if she knew. Later that day, I spilled my guts about climbing the skyscraper, which I immediately regretted. When Sunjo figured out that I was telling the truth, he stopped in the middle of the road and he laughed for at least 5 minutes. It didn't seem that outrageous to me, but I guess to someone who lives in the shadow of the highest mountain in the world, climbing a skyscraper is pretty lame. Does your mother know you are on your way up to Sagarmatha? He asked. I don't think so, and she would murder me and my father if she knew. We finally caught up to the truck that evening. Zopa suggested we take another climb before we ate, but Sunjo and I revolted and told him to forget it. The next day, he made us walk again. He gave us a break on the 4th day because we wanted us all to cross into Tibet together. We reached the Friendship Bridge about noon. I suppose if you're crossing south from Tibet into Nepal, the name fits. But if you're going north from Nepal into Tibet, there is nothing friendly about it. The Chinese border soldiers were surly, suspicious, and rude. They examined our papers for nearly an hour and peppered us with questions I didn't understand. Zopa handled the answers calmly, but the rest of us were nervous, especially Sunjo, who had started to sweat even though it was only about 35 degrees. What's the matter with you? I whispered. Nothing, he whispered back. Chinese. The soldiers nearly dismantled the truck looking for contraband. They didn't find any, but they did manage to steal some of our stuff in the process, food mostly, but no one called them out on it. The day before, as we had walked, Sunjo had given me a short history lesson about Tibet and China. It wasn't pretty. The People's Republic of China invaded Tibet 50 years ago. Since that time, over 6,000 Buddhist monasteries and shrines have been destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of Tibetans have been killed or jailed. Which brings me to the boulder in the middle of the road. The prisoners were cracking into gravel. We passed by it an hour after we got over the Friendship Bridge, which sort of sums up what's happening on to the Tibetans. Or as Zopa put it later that night, our brothers in Tibet have been made slaves in their own country. We stopped at every monastery that hadn't been burned to the ground or dismantled by the Chinese, some of them well out of our way. The monks were grateful for the food, supplies, and gossip that Zopa and the Sherpas brought. It was clear that this was one of the half-dozen reasons Zopa had for taking me to base camp. Sunjo and I hiked every day and climbed every evening. By the time we arrived at base camp 10 days later, I was feeling strong, and so was Sunjo. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 10, and it's kind of funny that brings us back to the very first chapter in this book, if you remember. He was going by those Tibetans that were breaking up the huge boulder with nothing but like picks and axes. So now we're kind of caught up to where you were that very first chapter, and we'll go on from there. Okay, that's chapter 10.